My name is Michael Wood. Since the age of 17, I've been willing to die in service to my community. In the U.S. Marine Corps, I was Sergeant Wood.
Michael Wood spent 11 years in the Baltimore Police Department.
Michael Wood is a very honest individual. He was not liked by the Baltimore City Police because he didn't play the good old boy network game.
As my career developed, I set out to understand why people offend, instead of how they offend.
The reason why these consent decrees don't do anything is because there's no enforcement or changing of the mechanism of incentives for the officers. So all you're doing is talking about it.
I certainly was going to cross. I was ready to shoot if I had to, but I was never going to cross that line.
But you kind of wanted to shoot.
Sure. Get what you inspect, not what you expect.
So, or anywhere that's populated, is your metric is based off of arrest. So you don't actually go out and engage with the community, because that would be time that you could be getting the arrest that you're expected to get to prove that you're a decent officer. So you actually don't have any incentive to communicate.
Michael, we should be looking for goals to not have people end up in the criminal justice system. Instead, every solution we have is to push them into the criminal justice system.
It should not be up to Jeff Sessions to determine how Baltimore Police Department operates. It should be up to the residents of Baltimore. Jeff Sessions doesn't know anything about policing, never has and never will.
I want to read a quote that you gave the Washington Post, which struck me. You said, "When you work in policing, you're inundated early on with the us versus them mentality. It's ingrained in you that this is a war, and if someone isn't wearing a uniform, they're the enemy. It just becomes part of who you are, of how you do your job."
What I'm trying to say is that we are looking at people who are doing nothing new, and if we focus on the actions, then we can fix the things for next time. Because when you focus on people, we end up thinking we can chop the head off, they put a new person in and something will change. But if we don't focus on the methodologies and the institutions, then we will be
put them in a prison cell, do the paperwork, go back out and do it again. So what we really need is to change the incentives and disincentives so that no matter what the role, we're still going towards that objective that actually serves.
More occupation, more vehicles, if your answer continues to be violent, because we have to understand that everything about policing is inherently violent. I have come in there with authority and told you what you will do.
I had like a direct experience with that. So indirect experiences with the liberal creation of race or continuing perpetration of these constructs of society, which we know to be harmful. I'm recalling, I had this meeting in Portland where I was there to meet with the people in Portland and to discuss civilian policing and just present it to them so they would understand it. I don't even fight for these things, like just present it to them. And an activist group from there showed up at the meeting, and that's absolutely fine, of course, sit down and participate. But then the opening argument was to discuss and argue about what Veterans Stand did in relation to the Native American people and how, we didn't listen to anybody up during the tribal councils and all this stuff, and we needed to listen to these particular people more. And we were there directly to serve the Lakota Sioux who we were working with, but they would choose select people who we had nothing to do with to say that we should have been listening to those people. And when I tried to be like, hey, I understand what you're saying, but you're not Lakota Sioux, and none of them are complaining at all. So the people we serve are very happy with how we provided that service. So if you want to elevate their voice, then please do so, but their voice is not what you're saying. And then one of their male persons stepped up and was like, as a white male, you can't be talking like that to her. And I'm like, I thought you were a feminist who is now overstepping her voice, which is talking about someone else's voice. Like, I'm out of this conversation. I'm out. Peace. I'm done. I'm not playing this game.
No, yeah.
And I got up and left. There's nothing that I could do about that when, the left and the continuation of the races and the construct has become their base of power, which they shut everything else down because we're humanly instinctual to continue our base of power. And next thing you know, you're writing constant literature about Black pain and Black trauma and oppression and you have absolutely no incentive to ever find solutions because your career is dependent upon the continuation and proliferation of the pain of others when you say you're doing the exact opposite. It infuriates me.
Yeah, I mean, I know that in my experience reporting, almost without fail, all of the well-known and vocal activists on issues related to race or criminal justice in Baltimore are either not from Baltimore or they grew up in non-impoverished circumstances. You know, and one of the most vocal and prominent voices was raised by a sheriff's deputy. You know, his father spent his entire career in the sheriff's department in Baltimore City, and I know because I wrote a piece on him after his retirement from the force. And that's not to say that this person's voice is therefore invalid, but to the extent that a lot of these advocates argue that Black voices are silenced when talking about criminal justice issues, which largely just implicate poor Black people in Baltimore City, they are silencing the people that they claim shouldn't be silenced. And they are using race as a proxy for voice or as a proxy for perspective or outlook, right? Which is really no different than the traditional racist narrative of how race works, which is to say that some biological feature determines your behavior and outcomes in the world.
Yeah, or your ability to absolutely understand something at all. And so I think this leads us into the postmodern discussion real quick. And what the example I've been trying to put out in public is when I get told to elevate Black voices, I say, guys, this is a crazy concept. Would you like me to retweet Sheriff Clark every single day? Or would you like me to espouse the policies of Eric Holder? That is not your measurement of where voices should be elevated. That is preposterous. Why are you saying this to me?
Yeah, I mean, and it's one of those ones. Has the left thought through the implications of its ideology? Because we see this a lot, especially in like the whole cultural appropriation debate, right? And when I first encountered the term cultural appropriation, it tended to be used in contexts where, say, white persons were wearing ethnic Halloween costumes, or I had a situation in my law school where a group of white students threw a quote unquote bullets and bubbly party where they all dressed up as like stereotypical rappers, like putting fronts in their mouth and shit like that and posting the pictures on social media, and it became this controversy, right? But to me, like, that's not cultural appropriation. To me, that's just like some white people being assholes. And it's just obviously like that is an instance of racism and privilege. But if once you start defining culture as essential, then you're essentially back in the trap that Europeans fell into, which is that they looked at societies that didn't have their technological savvy, for example, and said they're primitive, and their culture is essentially tied to their biology, their skin color, or whatever it was, and that biology drives the inferiority essentially of their culture, which is what gave Europeans the authority to sort of correct their humanity and their deficiencies. And so, I just want those of us who are, who think of ourselves as being on the left side of the spectrum, or who define ourselves as progressives, to be honest about what we're saying when we're making certain types of arguments, right? Just because you're confronting what you understand to be a white power structure doesn't mean that you're not implicated in problematics that are just as racialized.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And like those perpetration, as I would say, of the social constructs and keeping them alive and not understanding the difference is the harm. And that's why I was saying this is related to the postmodernist discussion. So I've heard postmodernism kind of like slammed around as like crazy, the thoughts of crazy people. So maybe I don't exactly have the scholarly version down, but let me just explain quickly my understanding of what postmodernism is.
Yeah, let's do this.
And that's there's an objective reality And then there's the reality of our social constructs which we operate in. So an example of this is U.S. currency and how it is objectively worthless. It is a worthless piece of paper that has no backing other than the good faith of the U.S. And I don't know if the good faith of the U.S. is an actual backing, and nobody will argue that it is. But in the social constructs of our nations, our borders, our states, our classes, our races, all of these things, the money does have a value. So just because something is objectively true, the money doesn't have value, does not mean that it matters to us. Like, it's objectively true that it doesn't have any value, but it has value to us. So it matters to us as having the value living in this social construct. And so what that ends up kind of understanding that those are
around me, cream.
Sure, cream. And then just because something is true in our social construct doesn't mean that it matters to the social construct of another. So our U.S. currency may not matter at all to somebody in South Africa, for instance, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, and it doesn't necessarily matter that we value the money. That doesn't matter to objective reality. To objective reality, it's still zero. So this is kind of like the Matrix, where the Matrix is our social constructs, but there's no way out of the Matrix for us because we are a societal species that only thrives because of the societal constructs. It's just that we must be constantly aware that there is a subjective reality of social constructs and there is an objective reality of scientific truth.
Yeah, I mean,
that's it. That's all I understand it as.
I mean, fundamentally, our species mediates reality through language. And language only works socially, right? If each of us had our own vocabulary for everything, we wouldn't be able to communicate. Which is to say that we mediate our reality entirely as a species through social constructs. That's what we've got, right? We don't mediate it on the basis of objective anything. All we've got is language, and language is a social construct. And as a result, there's really no way, I think, to completely escape that. But to me, the insight of postmodernism is simply to recognize that fact and to recognize that there's a difference between objective reality and the way we describe objective reality. And this is kind of
okay. So I'm not crazy, right?
No. I mean, to me, the one thing about postmodernism is that I think that just as the title doesn't have any determinative content outside of modernism, postmodernism itself doesn't really have a content of its own. It's got a basic critique of modernism, which is that our language is not reflective of an objective anything, and therefore cannot be relied upon as a source for truth. But it hasn't necessarily yet asserted a different viewpoint that we could give its own sort of title to, or that has its own content. Postmodernism is still essentially just a reflection and critique of modernism, and I think as a result, the title makes sense. It's what do we understand in light of our experience of modernity. And I think if we want to make a simple distinction between sort of antiquity and modernity, is that in antiquity, the basic anthropological assumption was that humans are a soul with a rational mind that discovers truth through contemplation, culminating in the knowledge of God. In the modern era, and depending on where you want to place that line, but it's around the beginning of the 16th century, really the shift is that we begin to start thinking about humans as a soul with a rational mind that discover truth by contemplating nature, and that we receive objectivity from nature directly. And increasingly, what postmodernists came to believe is that, and this is a term that philosophically begins with Nietzsche, but really doesn't reach its a sort of full maturity as a movement until the 20th century, especially with post-structuralism and continental philosophy out of Europe, figures like Derrida and Foucault. What they essentially found or argued was that our language, which is a reflection of our quote unquote rational understanding isn't a reflection of anything. It's just a series of sort of social constructs and ambiguous statements that doesn't even give us anything remotely close to what we think of as truth, unless we limit truth to the operation of statements.
Let me throw in one there that is a real good example for everybody to understand. You know that damn Spice Girls song, Because My Family Watches America's Got Talent?
Okay.
And Mel B is on there. You know that Spice Girls song, If You Want to Be My Lover, You Got to Get With My Friends?
Yeah.
So to Americans, we're like, wait, what did you just say? But in England, get with my friends just means you got to be down with everybody that I'm down with.
Yeah.
But there's already that entire song would give anybody reading it from an American social construct, which is super similar to a British social construct. It gives us pause, and the song means something entirely different.
and that's exactly it. And that's, so for those of us who I guess are and look, I mean, I suppose everyone's interpretation of what postmodernity is, can shift. But I think most of us who think of ourselves as, falling on the postmodern side, essentially accept this critique of our supposedly objective understanding of reality. And to give another example is the scientific historian Thomas Kuhn, who essentially said that the historical narrative about scientific advancement is that, one breakthrough kind of leads to another on this great rational ascent up to sort of greater and greater knowledge of the objective world. But he argues instead that if you look at scientific history, there are paradigms that operate at a given time that allow certain scientific discoveries and outcomes. And then the paradigms shift, and then those paradigms allow different outcomes than the previous paradigm would have. And you couldn't get from one paradigm to another, right? You couldn't sort of ascend logically from one position to the other. Something simply has to shift, and it creates a new set of possibilities. And that's a summation of postmodernism, to the extent that once upon a time, we kind of assumed we were just like ascending this ladder of knowledge. And now we're beginning to understand that our context and our location kind of dictates the outcomes and conclusions that we might reach.
Yeah, maybe think of it as like a multiverse of socially constructed worlds overlaying the world of objective reality. And what I would like to leave this with is that, in very much like the movie The Matrix is the social constructs under which we all operate. And maybe, in reality, we can't get out of the Matrix, but also, I don't know if we want to be out of the Matrix. We have great power when we stand back and we understand that the Matrix exists and how it operates and how our social constructs exist. That's how Neo gets power, is by the knowledge that it is existing and how to manipulate it.
He also learned Kung Fu.
Yes, but maybe we can learn Kung Fu faster if we get with our social construct and understanding of objective reality. Maybe we can find a way to make Kung Fu a sleep program.
All right, I think we've got postmodernism. This has been another episode of Nuance, a production of On Background Media Incorporated for StayUp.News. Intro and outro music provided by Baltimore's God Sense Beats. If you are a regular listener, please consider supporting our work, which you can do for as little as $1 a month. Simply go to patreon.com/StayUpNews, StayUpNews, all one word, and select your monthly donation and reward tier. Again, that is patreon.com/StayUpNews. On behalf of myself and Michael Wood Jr., thank you again for listening.